Okay, so going to continue reading chapter 1 of Brave New World. All right. I'm going to reread the last paragraph that I did. Okay, so the students are getting a tour of the hatchery. Embryos are like photographic film, said Mr. Foster waggishly as he pushed open the second door. They can only stand red light. And in effect, the sultry darkness into which the students now followed him was visible and crimson, like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer's afternoon. The bulging flanks of row on receding row and tier above tier of bottles glinted with innumerable rubies, and among the rubies moved the dim red specters of men and women with purple eyes and all the symptoms of lupus. The hum and rattle of machinery faintly stirred the air. "Give them a few figures, Mr. Foster," said the director, who was tired of talking. Mr. Foster was only too happy to give them a few figures. 220 meters long, 200 wide, 10 high. He pointed upwards. Like chickens drinking, the students lifted their eyes toward the distant ceiling. 3 tiers of racks, ground floor level, first gallery, second gallery. The spidery steelwork of gallery above gallery faded away in all directions into the dark. Near them, 3 red ghosts were busily unloading demijohns from a moving staircase, the escalator from the social predestination room. Each bottle could be placed on one of 15 racks. Each rack, though you couldn't see it, was a conveyor traveling at the rate of 33 1/3 centimeters an hour, 267 days at 8 meters a day, 2,136 meters in all. One circuit of the cellar at ground level, one on the first gallery, half on the second, and on the 267th morning, daylight in the decanting room. Independent existence, so called. "But in the interval," Mr. Foster concluded, "we've managed to do a lot to them. Oh, a very great deal." His laugh was knowing and triumphant. "That's the spirit I like," said the director once more. "Let's walk around. You tell them everything, Mr. Foster." Mr. Foster duly told them. Told them of the growing embryo on its bed of peritoneum, made them taste the rich blood surrogate on which it fed, explained why it had to be stimulated with placentin and thyroxin, told them of the corpus luteum extract, showed them the jets through which, at every 12th meter from 0 to 2040, it was automatically injected. Spoke of those gradually increasing doses of pituitary administered during the final 96 meters of their course. Described the artificial maternal circulation installed in every bottle at meter 112. Showed them the reservoir of blood surrogate, the centrifugal pump that kept the liquid moving over the placenta and drove it through the synthetic lung and waste product filter. Referred to the embryo's troublesome tendency to anemia, to the massive doses of hog stomach extract and fetal foal's liver with which, in consequence, it had to be supplied. Showed them the simple mechanism by means of which, during the last 2 meters out of every 8, all the embryos were simultaneously shaken into familiarity with movement. Hinted at the gravity of the so-called trauma of decanting, and enumerated the precautions taken to minimize, by a suitable training of the bottled embryo, that dangerous shock. Told them of the test for sex carried out in the neighborhood of meter 200. Explained the system of labeling, a T for the males, a circle for the females, and for those who were destined to become freemartins, a question mark, black on a white ground. "For of course," said Mr. Foster, "in the vast majority of cases, fertility is merely a nuisance. 1 fertile ovary in 1,200. That would really be quite sufficient for our purposes. But we want to have a good choice, and of course one must always have an enormous margin of safety. So we allow as many as 30% of the female embryos to develop normally. The others get a dose of male sex hormone every 24 meters for the rest of the course. Result, they're decanted as freemartins, structurally quite normal, except," he had to admit that they do have the slightest tendency to grow beards, but sterile, guaranteed sterile, which brings us at last, continued Mr. Foster, out of the realm of mere slavish imitation of nature into the much more interesting world of human intervention. So free martins are humans in the society who are infertile. So only 30% only 30% of women in the Brave New World are able to have children. 70% of the population is sterile and unable to reproduce. And the term free martin is actually a biological term, and it is a reference to an infertile female mammal, and that basically has non-functioning ovaries. In the past, free martins have also essentially been referred to, or was a reference to, mammals that were intersexed, so had both male and female sex characteristics. And the term is kind of old. Free could mean willing to do labor or also exempt from reproduction. And martin is a Irish Gaelic word for cow or heifer. So it's literally a reference to infertile cows. Okay. All right. So Mr. Foster says they've moved into the interesting world of human invention. I think I may have said intervention, but it's in human invention. He rubbed his hands, for of course, they didn't content themselves with merely hatching out embryos. Any cow could do that. We also predestine and condition. We decant our babies as socialized human beings, as alphas or epsilons, as future sewage workers or future, he was going to say future world controllers, but correcting himself said future directors of hatcheries instead. The DHC acknowledged the compliment with a smile. They were passing meter 320 on rack 11. A young beta-minus mechanic was busy with screwdriver and spanner on the blood surrogate pump of a passing bottle. The hum of the electric motor deepened the fractions of a tone as he turned the nuts. Down, down, a final twist, a glance at the revolution counter, and he was done. He moved 2 places down the line and began the same process on the next pump. Reducing the number of revolutions per minute, Mr. Foster explained, the surrogate goes round slower, therefore passes through the lungs at longer intervals, therefore gives the embryo less oxygen. Nothing like oxygen shortage for keeping an embryo below par. Again, he rubbed his hands. But why do you want to keep the embryo below par? Asked an ingenious student. Ass, said the director, breaking a long silence. Hasn't it occurred to you that an epsilon embryo must have an epsilon environment as well as an epsilon heredity? It evidently hadn't occurred to him. He was covered with confusion. The lower the caste, said Mr. Foster, the shorter the oxygen. The first organ affected was the brain. After that, the skeleton. At 70% of normal oxygen, you got dwarfs. At less than 70, eyeless monsters. Who are no use at all, concluded Mr. Foster. Whereas his voice became confident and eager. If they could discover a technique for shortening the period of maturation, what a triumph, what a benefaction to society. Consider the horse. They considered it. Mature at 6, the elephant at 10. While at 13, a man is not yet sexually mature and is only full-grown at 20. Hence, of course, that fruit of delayed development, the human intelligence. But in epsilons, said Mr. Foster very justly, we don't need human intelligence. Didn't need long years of superfluous and wasted immaturity. If the physical development could be speeded up till it was as quick, say, as a cow's, what an enormous saving to the community. Enormous, murmured the students. Mr. Foster's enthusiasm was infectious. He became rather technical, spoke of the abnormal endocrine coordination which made men grow so slowly, postulated a germinal mutation to account for it. Could the effects of this germinal mutation be undone? Could the individual epsilon embryo be made a revert by a suitable technique to the normality of dogs and cows? That was the problem, and it was all but solved. Pilkington at Mombasa had produced individuals who were sexually mature at 4 and full grown at 6.5, a scientific triumph, but socially useless. 6-year-old men and women were too stupid to do even epsilon work. And the process was an all or nothing one. Either you failed to modify at all, or else you modified the whole way. They were still trying to find the ideal compromise between adults of 20 and adults of 6. So far, without success. Mr. Foster sighed and shook his head. Their wanderings through the crimson twilight had brought them to the neighborhood of meter 170 on rack 9. From this point onwards, rack 9 was enclosed, and the bottles performed the remainder of their journey in a kind of tunnel, interrupted here and there by openings 2 or 3 meters wide. Heat conditioning, said Mr. Foster. Hot tunnels alternated with cool tunnels. Coolness was wedded to discomfort in the form of hard X-rays. By the time they were decanted, the embryos had a horror of cold. They were predestined to emigrate to the tropics, to be miners and acetate silk spinners and steel workers. Later on, their minds would be made to endorse the judgment of their bodies. We condition them to thrive on heat, concluded Mr. Foster. Our colleagues upstairs will teach them to love it. And that, put in the director sententiously, that is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. All conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny. In a gap between 2 tunnels, a nurse was delicately probing with a long, fine syringe into the gelatinous contents of a passing bottle. The students and their guides stood watching her for a few moments in silence. Well, Lenina, said Mr. Foster, when at last she withdrew the syringe and straightened herself up. The girl turned with a start. One could see that, for all the lupus and the purple eyes, she was uncommonly pretty. Henry, her smile flashed readily at him, a row of coral teeth. Charming, charming, murmured the director, and giving her 2 or 3 little pats, received in exchange a rather deferential smile for himself. What are you giving them? Asked Mr. Foster, making his tone very professional. Oh, the usual typhoid and sleeping sickness. Tropical workers start being inoculated at meter 150, Mr. Foster explained to the students. The embryos still have gills. We immunize the fish against the future man's diseases. Then turning back to Lenina, 10 to 5 on the roof this afternoon, he said, as usual. Charming, said the director once more, and with a final pat, moved away with the others. On rack 10, rows of next generation's chemical workers were being trained in the toleration of lead, caustic soda, tar, chlorine. The first of a batch of 250 embryonic rocket plane engineers was just passing the 1100 meter mark on rack 3. A special mechanism kept their containers in constant rotation. To improve their sense of balance, Mr. Foster explained. Doing repairs on the outside of a rocket in mid-air is a ticklish job. We slacken off the circulation when they're right way up, so that they're half-starved, and double the flow of surrogate when they're upside down. They learn to associate topsy-turvydom with well-being. In fact, they're only truly happy when they're standing on their heads. And now, Mr. Foster went on, I'd like to show you some very interesting conditioning for alpha plus intellectuals. We have a big batch of them on rack 5. First gallery level, he called to 2 boys who had started to go down to the ground floor. They're round about meter 900, he explained. You can't really do any useful intellectual conditioning till the fetuses have lost their tails. Follow me. But the director had looked at his watch. 2:50, he said. No time for the intellectual embryos, I'm afraid. We must go up to the nurseries before the children have finished their afternoon sleep. Mr. Foster was disappointed. At least one glance at the decanting room, he pleaded. Very well, then, the director smiled indulgently. Just one glance. And that is the end of chapter 1. So what you may have gathered by now, okay, is that this society is incredibly scientific. Babies are not born. They are essentially created in a lab, okay? And everything about their development is highly, highly controlled. And they create in this lab castes of people, okay? They create twins or clones, so you can have 96 people who are all essentially identical. Of course, that the idea is that if you create these identical people, then they will go out and work, and then people are divided into these 5 castes, okay? And at the top of the caste list are alphas. Then next is betas, gammas, deltas, and epsilons, okay? And they're all color-coded, and you'll learn what the colors are, but essentially alphas are top of the line, like the best people who are created, and as they go down the list, epsilons are humans who are essentially artificially created to be less than. Okay, as I said, they starve the embryos of oxygen, they give them x-rays, all kinds of things in order to create ultimately humans who are going to fit into certain components of society. All right, and we will learn more about what each of those castes are expected to do. Essentially, alphas, the head group, can think for themselves and kind of do what they want, although the expectations of society are pretty strict, all the way down to epsilons, who essentially are more or less human slaves. Okay, and we will get into that. So that is chapter 1 for Brave New World. Hope you find it interesting. It's a little bit weird talking about all of the technical scientific aspects of how this society makes babies and is created and all of that type of stuff. But essentially it's a framework, right, for how everything is set up. So Huxley, very much on purpose, starts the book with a tour of where these humans are made so that we as the audience can have an understanding of how everything is set up. And more about society will be revealed as we move on. All right, that's the end of chapter 1.